Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Art Toronto stage. My name is Grace Warren, and I head up a global brand and sponsorship for RBC Wealth Management. On behalf of RBC, I'm very pleased to introduce the presentation on the Art Toronto stage. Our purpose at RBC is to help clients thrive and communities prosper, and we care about investing in places where we live and work. Supporting the arts is a key priority for RBC because we recognize that the arts are the heart and soul of our communities. We're honored to be a part of the Art Toronto community now in our 11th year as presenting sponsor. As part of our ongoing commitments to the arts, we're proud to support artists through various programs and events, such as the RBC Canadian Painting Competition, which helps discover emerging Canadian artists. Every year, we announce a short list of 15 finalists, an award of $25,000 cash prize to one artist who becomes part of the RBC corporate collection. The work of the 15 finalists are on display at Art Toronto, and we invite you to view them just outside the RBC VIP lounge. RBC is very fortunate to play a role in profiling the outstanding work of artists in Canada and beyond. We're pleased to support the National Gallery of Canada and its upcoming presentation of the Venice Biennale 2017, featuring the renowned work of Vancouver-based artist Jeffrey Farmer. We feel that the arts encourage a culture of creativity and innovation, and by supporting the arts, we're helping to nurture the creativity you see on display here at Art Toronto. We want to celebrate the role that it plays and the impact on the development of the arts in Canada and their emergence on the global stage. Our discussion this afternoon, entitled Echoes of an Influence, examines the importance of Canadian art history and how it has shaped the work of today's leading contemporary artists. It's my pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists, Sara Angel, Executive Director, Art Canada Institute, Massey College, University of Toronto; Colleen Heslin, artist and past winner of the RBC Canadian Painting Competition; and Naomi Potter, Curator at the Esker Foundation in Calgary. To get the conversation started, I'd also like to welcome our moderator this afternoon, Corrie Jackson, Associate Curator for RBC. Thank you for joining today. I promise it's going to be a lively discussion.
Thanks so much, Grace, and thank you all for joining. I think it'll be a fun one. There's some wonderful ladies on stage that I'm going to take some time to introduce a little bit fuller. So thank you for joining us for the Echoes of Influence, where we're going to be discussing and investigating the role of legacy and mentorship in Canada. And I think that the poignancy of this topic seems to really be surrounding us in Toronto right now. You can see kind of relevant exhibitions reflecting on kind of regional histories and the influence of senior artists on the emerging ones at the AGO, the Justina M. Barnacky Gallery, and Philip Monk's new book, Toronto is Burning. And it's also something that's quite personal to us at RBC, because through the art collection, we have a commitment to supporting a network of emerging artists through acquisitions into the collection, and also through our Emerging Artist Project that sponsors a lot of mentorship opportunities nationally and internationally. So the role of influence is constantly on my mind, and when we acquire work, the pieces that we acquire become a part of this dialogue. The collection's been growing since 1929, so when we purchase and acquire a work, it becomes a part of a conversation with a lot of these historical and legacy pieces. So we've invited our three panelists here today as they each offer, I think, a really different and valuable lens on the role of legacy and how a contemporary art community is negotiating, considering, and questioning the narrative of Canadian art. And they're all pushing that contemporary dialogue forward, looking back to the legacy of artists who've come before and using that to impact their influence and shaping our contemporary community. So I'm going to take some time to further introduce all of our panelists. So Sara Angel is with us. She's the founder and executive editor of the Art Canada Institute. It's an organization dedicated to Canadian art historical research, the education and promotion of it, based at the University of Toronto. Angel holds a Trudeau Doctoral Scholarship, the most prestigious award of its kind in Canada, given for innovative ideas that will help solve issues of critical importance to Canadians. Art is definitely of critical importance. She completed her PhD at the University of Toronto. She writes on contemporary visual culture for publications including Maclean's Canadian Art, The Walrus, and the Globe and Mail to make the world of art more accessible to a broad audience. We also have with us Naomi Potter, the Director-Curator of the Esker Foundation in Calgary, who over the last 16 years has developed numerous curatorial, artist, and residency projects in Canada and Central and Eastern Europe. She's worked to develop solo projects at the Esker Foundation with Peter van Tijshausen, Cedric Bomford, Cynthia Gerard, Mir Fuhrer, Colleen Heslin, artist Etienne Zach, to name a few. In 2003, she was awarded a year-long residency at the DAAD in Istanbul, and from 2003 to 2007 was the co-director of the International Artist Residency at CESTA in the Czech Republic. In 2015, she was both a guest of the Australian Arts Council and the British Council of International Curatorial Visit Programs. She holds a BFA from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, and an MFA from Concordia in Montreal. She's also recently curated the work of our third panelist, Colleen Heslin, in an exhibition entitled Needles and Pins, which is currently on view at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection until January 8th. In both installations of Colleen's work, she situated her pieces alongside the work of Jack Bush. And Colleen, who's joined us, is an artist and independent curator based in Vancouver with an MFA in drawing and painting from Concordia as well, and is the winner of the 2013 RBC painting competition. And you can see her work in our VIP lounge if you take a chance to walk through that space. She has a BFA from Emily Carr University in photography, and Heslin's work explores the medium and crossovers between painting, sculpture, fiber, and photography, and her work has been published and exhibited in Canada, the USA, and Europe. And her artwork has a concern for formal abstraction, as well as craft techniques, creating abstract painting using experimental dyeing techniques. So we're going to be able to go a little bit further into depth of the influences that led you to that very distinct practice. I'd now like to give each panelist a further chance to talk about how this topic has influenced their process, their research that they've been working on in the past few years. I'm going to start with Sara Angel and the project that they've been working on entitled Under the Influence, where many of the country's most renowned contemporary artists reflect on references and important people to them throughout their history. So Douglas Copeland citing Lauren Harris, Kent Muckman cites William Nortman, Jeff Wall cites Emily Carr, Joanne Todd, Michael Snow. So there hasn't really been a real study of the impact of these historical artists on contemporary work. So if you can maybe give us a briefing on what it is that you're working on with this project, what sparked that conversation, and why it needs to happen now.
Thank you, Corrie. And before I begin, I would like to thank RBC for hosting this event, for Jamie and to Grace and Corrie for inviting me to be here. And it's really an honor to be in conversation with Naomi and with you, Colleen. Both of your work I admire so much. I wanted to first of all tell you a little bit about the organization I founded. Less than 3 years ago, I launched an organization at the University of Toronto called the Art Canada Institute to promote Canadian art history, research, and education. And the reason that I did this was because when I started teaching courses in art, I found that there was so little material available, either in print or in digital content, on Canadian art history. And then I also had a practice as a journalist, and I would interview artists. And I don't think she would mind me saying this. For instance, I interviewed Sherry Boyle, and I said, your work must have really been influenced by Joyce Wieland. And she said, I really don't know that much about Joyce Wieland. So I thought one thing that really needed to happen on the Canadian cultural landscape was to have material available in digital format that would be easily accessible for anybody to read. And so what you're looking at are the first 24 books that the Art Canada Institute will have completed by May of this year. And all of our books are written by experts in their field, by curators or art historians. They're all available simultaneously in French and English, and they're all available online from our site, which is, if you Google the Art Canada Institute, you'll find the books. And I'm really happy to say they've now been introduced into classrooms, universities, high schools across the country, and really have done an incredible job of bringing Canadian art history to the broadest possible audience. So that's sort of where I come from. But the mandate of the Art Canada Institute has always been to make Canadian art history a contemporary conversation. Because fundamentally what I do is I'm an art historian, and I want people to be engaged in our art history. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about a project that we have underway that we'll be releasing in 2017, a new program that we're going to be starting, and it's going to be called Under the Influence. And the program is specifically about contemporary artists and how they have been influenced by historical artists. So in many ways, what we're interested in doing with this project is tracing a genealogy in Canadian art and Canadian art history, going back to roots and finding how people take inspiration and where that comes from. Because we believe without a really strong understanding of our visual culture identity, it's harder to go forward. And the best way to move forward is to have a foundation. So what you're looking at on screen is a picture of Greg Curnow and a work that he created called Large Color Wheel. And Greg Curnow was an artist who was based in London, Ontario in the 1960s. He was very interested in promoting London, and he founded a school that's become known as regionalism. And it was about, let's look into our backyard, let's document the places around us, let's not be concerned with looking at New York, at LA, at Europe. Let's look at ourselves and find interest there. And what you're seeing now on screen is the cover of a catalog that he did called Heart of London, and interior pages. The guy with the mustache in the catalog is him. Greg Curnow was also very interested in color. This is a work that he did called Camouflage Piano. And another thing that Greg Curnow did was he created murals, most notably this one called Homage to the R34. It's a really interesting piece. You can see a detail on screen as well as the mural itself. It's a super interesting piece because the work was taken down in less than a week. It was created, it was put up in the Dorval Airport. It was a hugely invested in piece of work by the Canadian government. And then once it was put up, people saw it as being anti-American. And so it's only ever been seen by a very few people. So incredible piece. And so how does all of this tie into this topic, Under the Influence? Okay, so when you saw that color wheel, this is a detail of the color wheel. And if you look right between the green and the red line, the spoke, you can see Kahane, the words Kahane 1955. And it's a bit hidden in there. There are other artist names in there as well. But this is sort of a little known fact that people tend to skip over. And I wanted to mention Kahane because number one, the Art Canada Institute has done a wonderful book on Esker Kahane. Also, we've done a great book on Greg Curnow. Also, there is a magnificent Kahane piece in the RBC top floor. So everybody should talk to these ladies to try to get a look at it sometime. But in fact, Esker Kahane, who was one of the founders of the group, the Painters 11, he was a huge influence to Greg Curnow. And this is a piece of art history that really isn't that well known. Esker Kahane came to Canada. He fled during the Second World War. He came to Canada. He originally came actually as a prisoner of war, a war detainee, because although he was a Jew, who fled Czechoslovakia. He went to England, and when he was in England, he was considered an enemy alien. So where did he end up? He ended up in a detainee camp in Quebec. And once he was there, he was discovered, his talent was discovered by the Montreal Star, and then he very quickly became one of Canada's leading graphic artists. He did more covers for Maclean's during that period than anyone else. He did incredible murals, which Greg Curnow was very inspired by. This was a mural that he did for Imperial Oil. He loved color, just like Greg Curnow did. I should mention that, interestingly, there's another parallel in their lives in that both men died sadly and tragically before their time. Greg Curnow while he was cycling in a cycling accident, and Oskar Kahane in a car accident. So if some of you are wondering why isn't Oskar Kahane better known, part of the reason is because after he died, in many ways his work wasn't promoted, and so that it was only people like Greg Curnow who were really interested in what he was doing. One of the things that Greg Curnow loved so much about Oskar Kahane's work was its color. And I have up on screen one of Oskar Kahane's amazing abstract works, as well as a picture of him with the group of 7. He's the guy standing just underneath the lamp. And so then when you start to see Greg Curnow's work beside Oskar Kahane's work, all of a sudden history makes a lot more sense. And there was clearly this very profound influence between these two men. But you'll never find anything that's written about this, because it really just hasn't been addressed, because we don't tend to trace the influences and the genealogies and the histories. And frankly, there need to just be more people who are writing about Canadian art history in general. So that became, in some ways, the genesis of a program that the Art Canada Institute is launching called Under the Influence, which we are going to start releasing, as I said, in 2017, looking where we have started to reach out to contemporary artists whose practice we admire and say, who is a historical artist that has influenced your practice? And so here we have Doug Copeland, who has been very interested in the work of Lauren Harris. And you can see the similarities in their works on screen. And Annie Pudagut, who was related to Pitsiolakashuna, one of the most important Inuit artists. Christian Chapman, Norval Morisseau, Jeff Wall, Emily Carr. And I want to talk a bit about the relationship between Louis Jacob and Greg Curnow, because that is going to be the first Under the Influence presentation that we release. And so when we reached out and we spoke to Louis Jacob, who has a remarkable show that he's curated that's on right now at the Justina Barnicki Gallery, and we said to him, so who was your influence? He said, Greg Curnow. And so what you're looking at is a self-portrait of Greg Curnow, and it's beside a sculpture that Louis Jacob created, and that sculpture is called Sphinx. And what you can't see, the sculpture Sphinx was shown a few years back at Nuit Blanche, but what you can't see is that Louis Jacob created this work, and underneath it, he placed urban planning documents and historical documents about the making of the city of Toronto. And he created this classical motif of a sculpture, but left this, this space where the figure is holding up his hands in a window shape, so that it's all of us who's able to have a view out onto our city and out onto our surroundings. And very, very much what he's saying is we have our foundations based upon this amazing city, upon this amazing history. And so it was Louis Jacob taking an inspiration from Greg Curnow, who, if you remember a moment ago I said, was interested in regionalism, in looking out to his own backyard, in documenting Canadian history, in documenting his own bicycle, in documenting the place around him. In very much the reason that mural came down at Dorval Airport was because it was considered anti-American, with a messaging, look at Canada. We don't need to look farther. And so that's where, with Under the Influence, what the Art Canada Institute is going to be doing is really looking deeply into our history and making a connection between our contemporary artists and artists of the past. And I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Sarah. I think there's an amazing history, and it's great that you talked about Louis Jacobs' show, because if you do get a chance to go up to the University of Toronto, the relationships that he builds between a lot of the artists whose work you can also see at the fair, contemporary working artists in Toronto, alongside the artists who've influenced them, is really precedent. And to have an artist reflecting on that curatorially is quite interesting. I want to bring it on to Naomi Potter from the Esker. Thank you so much for joining us. I think, Sarah talked a little bit about that influence of the art historical, talking about Painters 11. We have a number of works by those artists in the collection, and when we acquire work, we're thinking about who can we put alongside it of a next generation. And you worked on this great exhibition by Colleen that has been contextualized quite a bit alongside the work of Jack Bush. So that relationship between artists, I think, is an important conversation. So perhaps you can speak about how that exhibition came to be and why now? Why was that work brought into the Esker?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to the RBC ladies for this and my panelists, and to all you that came out in the marshmallow fun jumpy castle, which is great. Can you hear? Because the sound is really awful up here because we have the jumpy castle being blown up in the back here. So, all right. Jack Bush and Colleen Heslin. Really interesting story. I will be the first to admit that I was not a Jack Bush fan, nor did I know very much about the work of Jack Bush when I started this project. The project actually, in fact, started quite early on, probably when I was interviewed for the position of Curator Director at Esker Foundation. Jim and Susan Hill, who are the founders of Esker Foundation in Calgary, are huge Jack Bush fans. And the day that I had the interview, I had a conversation with Jim Hill about Jack Bush. I think he was maybe quizzing me on my knowledge, and I played along, said, I absolutely love him, he's amazing. And I think that there was very much in his mind when he built this space, he was thinking about painting, for sure. We have a lot of natural light, and I'll go through the exhibition, but as you can see, very big spaces. What you're looking at right here are sort of the entrance. You walked in to Jack Bush paintings right away, and then flanked by two Colleen Heslin works. So the exhibition really started with Jim Hill saying, I would really love to see a Jack Bush exhibition at Esker. And I sort of deeply swallowed and said, absolutely, we'll get that done for you. And it took about 3 years for it to happen. And it was a little bit tough. Esker Foundation is primarily focused on contemporary art. We do not have a collection. The Hills do collect, but we don't manage that collection and we don't show it. So all of the exhibitions we do are temporary, and we do 3 a year. And our curatorial focus currently, that myself and Shauna Thompson, who's also in the audience, focus on are almost mini solo exhibitions of contemporary artists in conversation with each other. So we're less interested in group exhibitions with a giant theme over top and plugging artists into that theme, but really presenting 2 or 3 artists in conversation with each other. So didactics are around that artist's work and their production, and focused on, and we often commission work as well. And we don't provide a sort of a, this is how we see these artists are connected. And we found that it's, for an audience perspective, it's really great for people to make their own connections. Of course, we have this kind of overlying thinking about how artists can be placed with each other, but it's really about focusing on our artists' work and then allowing those conversations to come out organically. So, of course, Jack Bush kind of threw that all out the window because we had been showing primarily contemporary, and we continue to show primarily contemporary. But I had this huge task. Jim and Susan are very hands-off in terms of the programming. It's really the staff and myself who direct, which is quite unusual for a private foundation. It's often very much a vanity project with the founders directing sort of where we go with the exhibitions, but this is absolutely not the case. And this has really been the only thing that Jim and Susan have asked for, so of course we wanted to make it happen. I went to Edmonton for the opening of the Jack Bush show that Sarah Stanners and Mark Mayer organized for the National Gallery, and they did a smaller version in Edmonton, and I went up to Sarah Stanners, who's here in the audience, and I said, "Hi, my name's Naomi, I'm at the Esker Foundation. You may know Jim Hill. Would you be interested in helping us curate an exhibition for the Esker Foundation?" And I really assumed that she would be completely burnt out from doing the National Gallery show, and she would say no, but in fact she said yes, which was absolutely incredible. So to get Sarah Stanners on board, I think was really, really important. I'm just going to cycle through some of these images. We're going into the left room, which had Colleen's work. And just to give you a sense of some of the, on the left is Memory Holes from 2016, dye and cotton on linen. That's 90 by 75 inches. That's a pretty big painting. And then the far back, Floating Vessels in Time and Space from 2016, dye and on canvas and linen. That's 90 by 80 inches. And the little guy, that's Log Cabin. That's just 20 by 16. So we really played with a lot of scale. The middle piece actually is the title of the exhibition came from this work, Needles and Pins. So we're back out in the main space. What you have in the center there is Gap, 25th to 26th December 1961. And The White Spot, which is a wonderful little painting from November 1960. When Sarah and I met in Toronto, actually, to talk about the show, we thought, how can we narrow down Jack's production to something that makes sense for us? And she asked me what sort of era I was attracted to, and I said I really liked the 60s, and she said, great, so do I. So we sat down, and Sarah and I went through many, many works and kind of pulled out almost a best of the 60s. You could also almost say, so the earliest piece is from 1960, which is White Spot, and the latest work is Totem with Green from June, July 1973. So it was a very condensed and really nice selection of work. Just to give you a sense of what you're looking at. On the right is Counterpose. 2015, that's 72 by 60 inches by Colleen. And then on the left, running down the wall, we have Jewels from December 1964. That's 87 3/4 by 68 1/4, so you get a sense of the Indian Red Low. And then at the far back, Okemos 1 from May 1965. And then some little ones from Colleen, Seafoam and Still Life, both from 2016. So we had the Bush exhibition set up, and the question was, who was I going to show? What was the conversation going to be like between Jack Bush? And I think there was a sense that it was going to be kind of almost a conservative pairing, maybe a next generation color field painter. I had a lot of phone calls from color field painters of a certain generation who felt that, you know, their work would really be perfect alongside Jack Bush. And for me, it didn't sit right. I didn't want to do sort of a best of prairies, for instance, color field painting. I wanted to really push, what we do with our contemporary exhibitions is we push the envelope in terms of thinking and conversations and how these artists are really engaged in the world. And I wanted to do the same thing for Jack Bush. I didn't think because he was sort of a historical painter that there should be any reason why we should treat his work any differently. I was sitting at my desk one day looking at a Border Crossings magazine. There was a review actually of a former show, and I also had the National Gallery catalog open, and I came across an article on Colleen's work written by Lee Henderson. And I think Colleen will actually show you a work or a very similar work, but it was when she was doing gray with a kind of blocks of color. And I had the Bush catalog open at one of these wonderful kind of banner pieces, and it was this kind of incredible moment where it just made sense. There was like a spark. You could call it a curatorial spark. Sometimes these things don't make a lot of sense at the moment, but it just felt right. So I shot off an email to Colleen and I said, hey, do you want to do a studio visit? Didn't tell her about the program at all, didn't say what we were doing. Here's another close-up. and went to Vancouver, did a studio visit, and really liked what I was seeing, and I thought that it would be a really interesting conversation. And the reason I thought it was going to be an interesting conversation is because Colleen wasn't really doing what Jack was doing, which was perfect for me. You know, here's Jack Bush, color field, a lot of color, get on there, it's really physical, it really comes from the gut. And Colleen was dyeing fabric and cutting it up and laying it on the floor and sewing it back together and then stretching that canvas onto the supports. And I thought that it was almost the contrast to what Jack Bush had been doing. But in the very same sense, it was exactly what Jack Bush was doing, but just in a different time. And I really like the juxtaposition between the two of them, incredibly. This was a really fantastic show to hang. This is probably one of the most incredible. So in the far wall, we've got Ochre Top from 1965, in the middle, Cherry's Bend from 1965, and Rose Red and Red from January 1966. And they're all around between 80 and 90 by 60 and 70. So nice, big, bold, fantastic pieces. And then two of Colleen's, I'll get to a close-up in a second, Seafoam and Still Life from 2016. At the end of my studio visit with Colleen, I said, we'd really love to do a show with you. How do you feel about showing with Jack Bush? And I think she was sort of like, because, she said, just me? And I said, yeah, just you. And that kind of started it. And she said, yeah, sure, why not? And originally, actually, the work that I had thought was going to go with this work was gray tones with these bars of color, which would be an obvious choice given the works that we were showing with Bush. But in fact, working with Colleen is a really interesting. She makes work like a devil. It's crazy. So I would go to Vancouver, I would pick works, I would say, yeah, that one, thinking that I would have the show. You know, as a curator, that's how you want to kind of pin down work and then go from there. So I would pin down work, and then I would get back to Calgary, and she would send me an email with 4 more paintings that she'd finished in the last 24 hours, and they were better than the ones that I had just seen. I mean, it wasn't that extreme, but it felt like it. So it was like constantly redoing the list of the works that we were going to show in the exhibition. And that happened all the way up to the end. Actually, she brought new paintings in her suitcase that she stretched at the gallery. So almost all of the work was 2016, with a few exceptions from 2015, but it was an absolutely incredible body of work. Oops, gonna go back. Just in closing, I would say, and this will come up, but I was asked what impact the exhibition had. And for me, what was interesting was Jack Bush has a huge following, still does. And I will say that after living with the work for 3 months, I'm a huge fan. It's, you know, if I was ever gifted a Jack Bush work, I would take it in a second. The work is incredibly powerful, and it sticks with you and it stays with you, and you fall in love with them in ways that you would never ever expect. And, you know, coming from a, you know, fiercely contemporary position, to fall in love with a male abstract color field painting is sort of like the last thing that I want to admit to, but I did it. And what was amazing is that we had die-hard Jack Bush fans. If you become a Jack Bush fan, you become a die-hard Jack Bush fan. So we had those people coming to the exhibition and being so excited because you'd never seen that many Jack Bush paintings that far west. Probably will never again see that many Jack Bush painting that far west. So they came in like, where's the Jack Bush? Where's the Jack Bush? Give it to me. And then they were like, what's this? What is this Colleen Heslin painting? And they left more in love with Colleen Heslin than they entered the space in love with Jack Bush, which was a really interesting thing. And then conversely, we had a lot of art school students, particularly young women, who had heard about Colleen's work. She's like a radical painter. She's not painting, she's sewing, and she's dyeing fabric. And that, for an art student, is radical. It's exciting. And they came looking to see her work and saw her work and then turned and went, holy I want to swear, but I'm not going to. What is that? And being drawn in by the colors and the forms of Jack Bush. So here you have two opposite generations, an older generation, absolutely, who came to the exhibition wanting Jack Bush, but left understanding Colleen and wanting to follow Colleen, and then a younger generation attracted by how Colleen works, and then being informed or seeing that information through Jack Bush. So I think that that's a really exciting idea.
Absolutely. I think those conversations are so essential to what institutions like yours can offer. And for one that's so known for having contemporary work, I think it gave a new life to how we understand Bush's practice as well, and has seen that conversation in action. It definitely also brought Colleen's work to a new light. I've been following it for quite a while, and the impact of the color has always been kind of an important aspect of that, and seen it in the context of someone like Jack Bush, whose work is so known for that color field, impactful, bold statement. I think it brought it into a different level of conversation, and seen it art historically contextualized.
Well, it was almost
very
like
exciting.
we put Jack Bush on a contemporary
Absolutely, you put him into a
platform.
contemporary plane.
But by also doing that, we put Colleen Heslin into art history.
Absolutely, and I think that impact, and seeing and reading the reviews about it, and seeing both artists represented as equals to each other was really a pleasure for me to get to see. So Colleen, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really glad that you were able to come. I think it's important that when we talk about art history, we also talk about the contemporary and speak with artists that are making right now. Because in 60, 100 years, how are those artists going to be contextualized? And Colleen, the work that was at the Jack Bush show was definitely, of a moment in your making where you can see in the slides there were some really impactful, bright colors that were used throughout. And if you guys get a chance, there's work that's up at Monty Clark's gallery as well, kind of just down the aisle, that has some different tonalities to it. And if you can speak a little bit about your practice, I think, as Naomi alluded to, it's very much a studio practice, very physical, very different than painting on canvas. So if you can talk about that, and then maybe some of the influences since we're looking at Jack Bush, and be contextualized alongside his work, and I'll let you speak. But
okay. Hi, thanks everyone. So I'll start with an image that was, like from 2014, and so these were this is called Yesterday's Parties, and there was another work that I had done that was in the Art for Heart auction last year called Burning Bush. So I was sort of making these little jokes, like Canadian art jokes, about like this idea too of how at the point when Jack was working, a lot of his peers they would develop like a type of icon and repeat it with variations. And so I think what you think of with a Bush work is his color stacks, even though he has a larger body of work outside of that or beyond that. And so I was also thinking about being Canadian and how our major histories are very minor internationally. So for me, like the influences I'm going to show are a bit more international, and generally looking closer at female histories and craft histories as well. So it's a pretty diverse influence, and it wasn't. This was a part of the work that started this conversation, and we had talked about like looking back and selecting work. And then I had just set up a new studio, and there were shifts that were happening in my practice where I was working with different material, and I dye the material, but got back to like a heavier linen and canvas. So the shifts that were happening, it wasn't. There was too much difference, and so, and I was working on a solo for a show in Vancouver at the Charles D. Scott at the time. And that work was also the beginning work for I knew that some of that work was going to be expanded on and end up in this Esker show. And so I'm going to get into some of the influences, but in terms of how I work, I'm like collecting materials, building these libraries of color. And so a lot of the colors and the textures, they're all sort of pre-decided, and so this sort of time that goes into the making is there, a lot of that is happening in the earlier stages of a body of work. And then I'm like, because since I heard about the show, I was working on it every day, but just what was happening, there's a lot of, like, not everything at the beginning of a project is successful. So a lot of that is just like building on what's, pushing aside things that aren't working and focusing on what's working. So as it developed, the focus really narrowed in, and we had a chance to meet about a month before the show and a lot of works that I thought were going to be in were not, and then so it was this. Yeah, it was a pretty the ending of this project. It's a large space, and it was the first time working on that scale. But yeah, exciting, exhilarating. Yeah. So this is an early quilt. It's a crib quilt by Sonia Delanier, a very early Cubist work from 1911. It was a when I started working in this way, I hadn't formally studied painting. I done my undergrad in photography and worked in a lot of mediums, and I'd always painted, but I sort of had that separate. Like, I just painted in my studio or at home, and not so much in a public setting. And so I was in this position where I was really going back, like re-looking at history and working up to the present, to just, for myself, to just try to understand, just with a more depth, the concerns and the motivations and the pushes of what was really these conversations, and how these conversations from early modernism is linked to postmodernism and contemporary work. And this is a pretty significant work. It's very early, and I'm interested in the bridging of it as an artwork, but also it was a quilt that she made for her son when he was born. So also the utilitarian necessities that are also motivating factors, and these questions that were really in my head about the idea of the connection between a domestic work and professionalization, and just the values that we're associating with materials and labor and gender. So those were all informing the early motivations in my practice. This is another quilt by, it's an Amish quilt, and these quilts are really informative to a lot of American modernist paintings, and interested in how bold the designs were in this work, but there's also this very highly labored, detailed stitching. So just this interested in the simplicity, but also how rigorous and complicated it was. And then again, you have it being in the realm of craft, it being anonymous labor by women that was being borrowed from from artists working in New York, and kind of seeing those influences and having a lot of questions about authorship and the work. And this here is a more recent influence. It's a tantric painting made in India. It's also anonymous work. There's some families that produce this work, and I was introduced to it this summer. Well, Eli Bronowski had curated a show at the Ora Gallery in Vancouver where some of these works were, and there's a book called Tantric Song, and the story of how they got introduced to into I guess Western culture was there was a poet in France who was really interested in the work. So he had done all of these pilgrimages to India to try to find this work, and the elusive quality of it was he ended up going there and getting in an accident and in a car crash, and ended up having to spend years back in France recovering, and then came back again and visited with somebody who gave him a name and was able to kind of start collecting this work, and that's how it became a book. So I saw this as I was working on a solo exhibition that I did at Monty Clark in this September called Somatic Traditions. And what I was really interested in this piece was I was working on a large painting at the time, and the work that I was doing, especially after this bush work, was very reduced. I was working with like dyed canvas, but it was like just off white. So like just working with these very subtle shifts. And so when I was looking at this, I was just looking at the paper and like these tabs that were happening and this like used paper and how it's just like this idea of like a blank space that's never blank, that there's, and so that started to inform the work that was already in production. And so I had this work was mostly made, and it was a piece that I had started and had to put aside because other things were happening. And then when I returned to it, I know as I was finishing it, these tabs start to come in to that. And then there was another piece I was working on in the show that was this this used fishing rope from a residency I had done up at in Santula, BC, and the work was again in progress, and so the colors from this work that I was looking at ended up informing this piece. So then it was almost in a sense that like these influences became sort of like this small gouache drawing became a bit anthropomorphized and sort of divided and from like this 2D space into a 3D space, and this is called Push and Pull, and that's referencing the description of the meditations that this gouache piece was, the tantric work was about. And then these last two images are works that were in this show as well. So I was able to, because this was a smaller installation, I was able to play with the installation a bit more, and so these works are hung so they're centered to the body, and for me, a lot of the process of getting into the work that I do is questioning those starts to things and taking away a given. So I really was interested in centering the work in relation to the body and not to the eyes and not to the head, and this how we move work for our to suit our body, but that also interested in how work of art can also move the body and force you to move to adjust to it. So you're building and developing a relationship, like a physical relationship, and that's where like the title Somatic Traditions came into the show. And then this final piece here is it's a research project that I've been working on that started in the winter when I was doing in a group show in London. I went to the British Museum, and there was a Syrian statue called The Last Woman Standing, and I was a bit like, there was a lot of questions that came to me from I was interested in the work, but I was a lot of questions about like the description of the work. I found it a little bit problematic, and so I've kind of just developed this back and forth email to the British Museum, and I've done these like larger studies of the works. And so yeah, this is sort of this last piece that the smaller work that came into this show is a bit of a start to some like new work that is coming forward, and I think for sure like working this last year with having an exhibition with Jack Bush that Naomi included me in. I think through that process, I was able to. There were almost points of this sense of oversaturation of color, and it got me to a place where I was thinking a lot about how a work affects your body, and near the end of producing this work, got very, very interested in just like subtler shifts and what happens when like you are able to register things that are minute and subtle, and how a work that can be sometimes like loud and jump out at you, but really also interested in that shift in scale to something that's like quieter and maybe like affords a bit more space, and is slower in terms of how you read the work. Like it doesn't have an immediacy to it. So yeah, those are that's a part of like the arc of the last, I guess, year. Yeah.
You've definitely been drawing from so much over the last year, and thank you for sharing kind of what those sparks have been, looking at Bush, but then also past that, and I think bringing in some really important female artists and a legacy of that. I kind of want to just one question, and then I'd love to open it up to the audience. But something I think that you all touched on was kind of when you get written into art history. I think, Naomi, what you were talking about. And I just have a question. At what point do contemporary artists enter an art historical context? I know with what you're doing at the Art Canada Institute, having these artists that are working today contextualized alongside historical artists and being written about definitely places them in that dialogue. But just to start a conversation, I'd love to hear your thoughts. When do young artists become a part of art history? I want to leave it at that.
It's a really, really good question, Corrie. And I think in so many ways, when younger artists get written into art history is when curators like Naomi and Sara and art historians, as well as artists, start to quote their elders in some sort of way. So in the instance with Greg Curnow that I showed the picture of the big wheel, he literally wrote into his painting the name Kahane. Now that's an example of somebody identifying somebody who is in art history. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that there needs to be a documentation and a recognition. And that's why I think the show that was done, that you did, Naomi, was so important, because it is putting it out there that there is a connection and that there is an importance between contemporary art in a longer narrative and a longer tradition. And sometimes that connection is simply a connection where one's looking at shapes and forms and colors, and there's a relationship there. And sometimes it's a relationship where someone is very specifically saying, I was looking at this work and I decided to create that. But I think that the role of the curator, ultimately, the curator, the art historian, the journalist, the art writer, that's where it's so critical. That's where the dialogue begins. And because ultimately that's when people are looking back, what's creating an art history are those times where moments are recorded. So I really applaud the show that you did. It was fascinating to me to listen to it, because in so many ways what I'm trying to do with Under the Influence is what you were doing, but in a number of different segments that are recorded for art history.
For me, the show is interesting because it was actually incredibly satisfying being able to look at historical work. And I even feel uncomfortable talking about Jack Bush as historical, but being able to look at sort of contemporary practice and historical practice at the same moment is amazing. And I didn't mention this, but you can still see that exhibition. Both Jack Bush in studio and Colleen Heslin Needles and Pins are up at McMichael Canadian Art Collection until
January 9th.
January 9th. February 20th, you heard it here. We're extending the show to February 20th. So please do go up and see that, and you can have a sneak preview in the McMichael booth here. There is a real live Jack Bush and a real live Colleen Heslin painting in conversation. I'm just going to pick up what you said. I think it's the archive that's quite important in terms of art history when you go back to that. And I suppose as curators and art historians and writers, you are making the archive that future generations will go back to. If there isn't a place for that material, how are you going to do it? I think any art historian or curator or writer loves to jump into archives, and it's not even necessarily that thing you're looking for, it's the thing that's around that. So you could say, if I was doing research on Colleen Heslin, it would be Colleen Heslin and then sort of her contemporaries and what was she doing and how was the crying room connected to that, and you start to build art history. I guess my flippant answer would be the red balloons. That's when art history starts, in some sense.
Just to give some context, the red balloons are the AGO purchases that happened last night.
Because it's an institution saying this artist is important and we're going to bring it into our collection for you to consider in the future. And once an artist is in a collection, they're in art history. There's no denying that at all. So, but I think it's kind of all of our work to continue to document and write and have conversations around not only what's happening now, but the connections between what has happened and will happen.
I know we're kind of running short on time. Is there any questions from the audience? Okay, if it's quiet, then, oh.
Machine, something just,
Yeah, it's interesting because I was addressing this question yesterday. A lot of times people ask me about how the work is made and like the details of that. And I think, and yeah, I use a machine, but it's not the most interesting part of the work. I think that the question is really like, how did I get to make, like, what are the motivations and the factors that got into making the work and how it's thought about? But I think that what happens is that it gets, because there's this play with material, but because it appears from a distance as a painting, and then when you get close, it's sewn, and so there's this sometimes this surprise in a way, but it's still thought of as a painting, like I'm drawing on history, and with that there is a deliberate intention to play with those ideas of values that we do have for materials and mediums, like this value of painting and this value of craft. So yeah, it's machine sewn, but I've done in earlier works, like I've worked with hand sewing, but yeah.
Once you knew you were in the show, did those more recent works become more consciously derivative of Jack Bush than the earlier works? And if you could also maybe speak to the formal approach, whether in those 2016 works or earlier.
I'm going to jump in there as well, because I think the important thing was that Colleen actually, I didn't share with Colleen the Bush work that we were going to show. I thought it was really important for her not to know.
I mean Bush in general, not
well,
the specific
in general,
works.
but also so specifically about the works that were going to be presented in the gallery at the same time, because I didn't want to somehow cloud or influence Colleen in any way. So there was a real deliberate sort of blackening out of what we were going to show, which I think was really magical in terms of the connections that were made. But in the studio...
Yeah, so for me, I was working with just like putting together these samples of colors that I'd made, and then just looking at the work after and thinking about titling. And that's where that sort of play came into place, because there's also... but it's not. He's not an artist that I mean. I'm aware of his work and I've looked at him, but in terms of, and he's not a major like influence, maybe like at the big, yeah, just in a larger mix. Like I would say somebody like Frankenthaler would be maybe more of an influence than Bush, and there was also so much happening in the earlier works with with the way that the dye was resting on the surface of the fabric. That was this image and this echo of like my experience with photography. So I think because like I was just developing this practice that was like individual to me and in terms of like how I was working. So yeah, I think referencing history, but in no way did I want to like make a bush painting. Yeah.
Just like the knowledge.
I think
the
there's
knowledge of it, which I think is important for me. I mean, Colleen talked a lot about pushing against Jack Bush, which I thought was a really nice way to talk about sort of the history you're coming after. Was almost like a springboard to move forward.
I think there's some like tongue-in-cheek references, especially with the titling, that kind of push back against that, very male, abstract, expressionist history and bringing it into a very different dialogue and kind of flipping that conversation on itself. Sorry, we have another question. Hi.
I wanted to point out that Naomi and I were so turned on by Colleen's work because I quite frankly find it anything but derivative of Jack Bush. It really is not derivative as work, and I can say that because I've looked at thousands of Bush paintings now. It was exciting because there could be a conversation had between contemporary and historical, but there was no sort of proving of a hypothesis of influence. It was just exciting to see fresh, new work that maybe was building upon a past legacy, but was not created because of a past legacy. And I've met many artists that were certainly very influenced by Jack Bush and make a point of telling me, and there are some direct influences. So there's subtleties between artists and influences, but I don't find it derivative of it all. So I think it's important to say that. And also, there is a refreshing lack of irony in Colleen's work, which Colleen, myself, and Mark Mayer will talk about on Sunday, in her work, because there can be in contemporary work a lot of poking fun at the past. But what's nice is I think Colleen's work is certainly maturing. It's not at all, a punchline kind of art. I think it's really great. And the question I had, actually, is I'm interested in artists can talk about how they're influenced by past artists. But what's interesting is a viewer, when they come to an exhibition or a work of art, and I like the term that Colleen used, which is you're making a library of color. Well, I encourage people around me, look at art, look at more art, look at some more art, build your library in your head of both past and present art, and then when you go out into the world later, those things kind of creep up. It's why I'm in the business. I love it. I can, and I love contemporary, even though I'm very much in historical. But I'm interested in how you feel when I first met Colleen, she came to the McMichael, we're looking at a work that she had done right fresh. I said, have you ever looked at Ben Nicholson's work? Because for me, that came up to my mind, but I'm sure, and she said, no, not at all. So that's an interesting point too, is the influences that viewers can see. How do you feel about that, Colleen? Do you have people bringing up artists that you would never imagined your work referring to?
Yeah, I think that also tends to happen with artists that are more known regionally. So if you're in another region, there was a lot of artists that I was I didn't see my first Jack Bush painting until I moved to Montreal a few years ago. And living in Vancouver, there's no Jack Bush paintings there. A lot of people that don't know who he is in certain regions, and it depends on, I guess what you're, yes. So, I think that's a common thing that happens. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we have to wrap up for time, but thank you, Sarah. And Colleen will be in dialogue with Sarah and Mark May from the National Gallery up at the McMichael Sunday. If you can make your way up and see the exhibition, that'd be great. Thank you. Thank you so much.